We're all born with gifts and talents. Mine is not art. But even though I'm not good at art, I've been in the biology department for about 3 years, and I feel lucky to be there. So we're all born with gifts and talents, and as you can tell, mine is not art. Luckily, though, for the last 3 years, I've been in the biology department, and even though I'm not a very good artist, I really like art, and I'm extremely thankful for it in my field of study. Actually, when I think back to a lot of what I've learned in biology, it hasn't been words, it's been pictures, it's been motion diagrams, and as odd as it might sound, it's been feelings. But to be honest, I think that the majority of us do think that way, regardless of what fields we're in or jobs we might have. When we think back to anything in life, we can recall how we felt about it, how we experienced it, whether it be frustration or inspiration. We can remember a picture of it. But this makes sense because the way our brain works, we're more likely to remember something if we tie significance to it, if we relate to it with our own personal experiences, and if we relate to it with something we already know. So when we think about art and science, what do we picture and how do we feel? For me personally, when I thought of a scientist a few years back, I thought of someone disconnected. I thought of someone that, I couldn't approach, or there was a barrier between somehow. And when I thought of an artist, I thought of someone creative, down to earth, and someone that was warm, someone that I could talk to. Even though that I had never really, even at the time, probably met any artist or scientist, I had already painted a picture of them. And I allowed this picture that I painted to change the way I felt about these people, based on the stuff that I didn't even know they were doing. So, personally, one of the most important things colleges made me realize is how little I actually know. And even though it's made me realize how little I've actually known, it's made me feel and empowered to be able to learn. And another thing that it's taught me is that I should never underestimate the potential to learn from anyone or any situation. So it's funny because one of the last places I would have ever expected to learn about art would be a biology lab. But as luck would have it, when I had the opportunity this summer to travel to Maine and conduct research at the Mount Desert Island Biological Laboratory, I found myself not only at a research institute, but an art exhibit. See, personally, I apologize. If you've never been to Mount Desert Island, it's a small island off the coast of Maine, and it's home to Acadia National Park, where I've seen some of the most beautiful sunrises and sunsets. This was a picture I took right outside of our lab around 4 in the morning. And even though I hate to, I think I'm obligated to say, #NoFilter. When I first walked into the MDI biological laboratory, I have to admit, I felt a bit relieved. Not because I had finally finished driving 1,300 miles, but because it wasn't what I expected. See, I'd never really been outside of our laboratory here at this university. I never worked in someone else's or even seen another university's lab. So I guess I was a bit worried. I was worried that I would be spending the next 2 months somewhere with white walls and with people who only wanted to talk about research, that I would feel embarrassed if I had a question or if I didn't know something. But when I arrived, the thing that allowed me to feel comfortable and take away all my worries was art. See, in 2012, when the lab had first expanded and built a new building, they were walking through and they noticed how bare and empty the walls were. So they asked local artists if they would be willing to present their work and if they could hang it up. To their surprise, after only a year, artists from internationally were submitting their work to try to be submitted to display it in the lab. So with this interest, gain in interest, they started to create themes every year that artists could work around. And this allowed for scientists, well, I apologize again. This created so they could work around. But since it is a biology lab, they wanted to keep these themes centered around biology or science in general. So to do this, they not only wanted to just have art in the lab, that wasn't enough. They wanted to bring in artists into the lab and connect with scientists to explore the interaction and similarities between the two fields. This is Ben Lincoln and Dustin Updike. Ben, who's on the left, actually grew up on Mount Desert Island, and he came back to open up a studio in the same building that his father had once built handmade wooden boats in. His collaboration, he was matched with Dustin, who studies regenerative biology, and he looks at the certain properties of cells that allow for cell longevity. After their collaboration, Ben wrote a discussion on the experience and gave some insight into the works that resulted from it. This was one of the works that he had painted using oil on canvas. The center collection of red in the middle actually represents a neuron, and the lines coming from it with gray solid dots represent the thought impulses. Despite already having been really influenced by science, Ben discussed how he had become even more aware of how similar the processes of experimentation and discovery were for both scientists and artists. He makes the point that, like himself, Dustin uses tools to transform and manipulate, though the mediums they use are different. He says, in a way, Dustin is little like a writer, how a writer can manipulate and change the meaning of a sentence by adding words and changing punctuation. Dustin can change the meaning of can change the expression of a cell by manipulating the language of its genes. So, at the same time this was happening, there was another collaboration happening at the lab between Nancy Manor and Vut Yin. Aside from being a painter, Nancy is a photographer and mixed media artist. And while Vut, on the other hand, studies organ regeneration in zebrafish, they were paired together. After looking through some of his notebook pages, she asked the question, what was it like to look through the eyes of a scientist? So to create and to visually and physically connect both of their works, she embedded into her own painting media his copies of his work, pictures and diagrams and words that had meaning in her own field, such as regeneration and transformation. When she discussed it, she talked about how, despite it looking microscopic and close in range, there's this chaos, there's this weather that actually we see. And she talks about how it is this weather that's actually in both fields of discovery and scientists and artists alike. It's this chaos and just randomness that can get in the way. So when I had the chance, apologies. When I had the chance to actually ask Vut how he was affected by this experience, I was told that he would often come into the lab so focused on his research, have so much going on in his head, that he would just have to stop sometimes and look at this work and remember his connection with Nancy. And this would allow him to take a step back, reflect, and become re-inspired to continue. The purpose of these collaborations are not only to connect artists and scientists, it's to connect the community with the fields of art and science as a whole. It was art that first welcomed me into the lab and welcomed me on a personal level. Somehow it has that ability to connect and has the power to bring us together. So it's no surprise that when the lab opened as an art exhibit, people came and gathered there. I remember the first time I was working in the lab and I noticed unfamiliar faces peeking in to see what I was doing. When I realized that they were there for art meets science, I had to wonder if this was the first time they'd ever been in a lab, and if I was the first person that they'd ever seen conduct research. And if this was the case, how was I changing the way that they viewed scientists? Was it the same? Were they also feeling disconnected, or that I was unapproachable like I had once thought a scientist was? And so when I think back to that moment, I try to picture myself. I had gloves in my hands, and I was holding a pipette, but I was wearing my favorite concert tee, and I was listening to Jimi Hendrix. And when we made eye contact, all I could do is give them a courteous smile, because that's all I really knew how to in that moment, just to tell them that, hey, I was a person too. And really, I think that's all scientists at the lab wanted to do that summer is to just show people that we're humans too. And art gave them that ability. So this summer was, well, quite the opposite. Quite the opposite of everything that I had once worried about. The walls certainly were not white. I didn't just get to meet other undergraduates. I got to build relationships with them. We discussed so much more than art and research. We discussed life and how every single experience we had in our life had somehow brought us to this point, brought us to this one island. And we also were able to work in a place that embraced the beauty of not knowing, that opened its doors to anyone who wanted to discuss art or connect with those who conducted or created it. So, and actually, when I think about everything that I learned this summer, and when I think about everyone I connected with this summer, I don't think about them in images, actually, or words. I think about them in feelings first. I remember how they made me feel and how we made each other feel. For years, I've known there was a gap between artists and scientists, and more importantly, those in science fields and the general population. Though before the summer, I never was able to imagine what it would look like if there wasn't one. But like art, the purpose of science is to be communicated. And that's a similarity that Voet had noticed over his collaboration. It's about telling a story. And what's the point of telling a story if no one's there to listen, or if we're not willing to listen to someone else's? And that's one thing that I've really learned over my time in the lab. It's not about there's no point in my discoveries or anything that I learn if I can't communicate it, because art and science are both about communication and sharing what we find. And it's also what determines whether our story is read, our interactions with people inside our field and outside of our field. Without the collaboration of Ben and Dustin, or Nancy and Voet, there wouldn't have been any works to show today. So I'd like to just say that we're not scientists and artists first. We're human beings first, and artists and scientists second. And I'd like to end with actually one of the last things that Ben writes in his reflection. He says that in different but complementary ways, scientists and artists are about connections. Scientists work to discover how these connections work. Artists work to create them, like I do, by one work, by one individual, at a very human speed. Thank you.